By most accounts, almost all of the people protesting against the hateful bigots, the Nazis and Klansmen in Charlottesville, were peaceful, but not all of them. In their midst was a sometimes very violent group of protesters that call themselves Antifa, known to not only clash with bigots, but also sometimes with police and occasionally storefronts. At least 2 journalists in Virginia were assaulted by violent counter-protesters over the weekend, including this cameraman from the Richmond CBS affiliate. CNN's Sarah Ganim now takes us inside Antifa and shows us this group like you've never seen it before.
It's 6 a.m. in Portland, Oregon, and we're headed to a bar with blacked out windows.
They wanted to meet us really early in the morning because they're concerned about a lot of people being around.
We are meeting members of the Rose City Antifa, short for anti-fascist. This group's main goal is to disrupt neo-Nazis and white supremacists, but also take on government and capitalism.
Antifa is any group that's willing to stand up against fascists by any means necessary.
By any means necessary, they say, can mean outing a white nationalist at their work or to their neighbors. Or, as we've seen recently, violence, fires, property damage, hand-to-hand combat at protests across the country.
Explain to me the reasoning behind fighting.
You have to make it so unpalatable to be doing white supremacist organizing that they no longer want to do that. And historically, that's what's worked. You have to put your body in the way, and you have to make it speak in a language that they understand, and sometimes that is violence.
There's no firm number on how many Antifa activists there are in the U.S. because there isn't any one organization. Most are local groups that recruit and communicate through social media. But experts who track these organizations say their membership is growing in response to the rise of white national groups and the election of President Donald Trump. Violence and property destruction led to more than 200 arrests in Washington, D.C. on Inauguration Day. Prosecutors say they were wearing masks covered head to toe in black, a tactic the Antifa call black bloc.
People dress in black bloc for a few things. One,
Scott Crow has been leading anarchist and militant leftist groups for decades.
so people put on the masks so that we can all become anonymous. And then therefore we are able to move more freely and do what we need to do, whether it is illegal or not.
So some people will push back on that and say that the black bloc is to keep people from being identified and arrested when they break the law, when they commit crimes.
Damn right. It's a good way to avoid the ramifications of law enforcement.
We saw that firsthand at a May Day protest in New York City.
We cover our face because the Nazis will try to find out who we are. And that is a very bad thing because they harass people. When they organize, they kill people, they hurt people, they fight people. And we're the ones who are fighting back. They are the second coming of Hitler.
Police in Berkeley told us they haven't seen this kind of destruction since the 1960s. Law enforcement in other cities are dealing with similar situations, like in Portland, Oregon, where Antifa have been involved in at least 10 protests ending in violence, according to police. And it's wearing on the community.
It is new. It's like this rumble mentality of, I'm going to bring my friends, you bring your friends, and we're going to fight it out in the park. It's not something we've seen here. It's not good for the city. People are just frustrated by it. It's affecting their livability. It's affecting their business.
Has it become more violent?
It happens quicker. The fire starting that we saw on May Day is something we haven't really seen much of in the past. The running through the street, breaking windows and everything in sight. We haven't seen it as consistently as we've seen it in the last 8 months.
But it's the violence that's gotten them attention, directly confronting groups that preach white nationalist rhetoric, like on Inauguration Day, when white nationalist Richard Spencer was punched in the face. And it was the Antifa movement that caused Berkeley to cancel speeches by extreme right provocateurs like Milo Yiannopoulos.
If there are the more hardcore elements, the white supremacists and neo-Nazis that go to these rallies that are itching for a fight, we're there to say, we'll stand in your way.
on your side of the street.
We went there to take one of our guys to the bathroom.
Fight. Stay on your side of the street.
Our guy went to the bathroom, officer.
This is bullshit. You're out here trying to keep the peace, and you're running across the street trying to pick a fight. Stay on your side of the street.
We were just trying to...
I don't want to hear it. Stay on this side of the street.
Tiny, okay. He's there, guys. Keep on staying. Let's hear for Tiny.
Justice for Tiny! Justice for Tiny!
Resist the resistance, Tiny.
Hey,
Get on your fucking property, you fascist.
Fuck you!
Fuck you.
Hold tight! Hold tight! Hey! Jesse! Let them fucking go! Fuck you!
Fuck you!
Hold tight! Hold tight! Hold tight!
Fucking scumbags! What the fuck is wrong with you? What the fuck is wrong with you?
I love you!
Really?
Fuck you!
Don't move! What the fuck is wrong with you, fucking scumbags?
Fuck you! Shit! Get back! Fuck you! You're not doing anything!
Fuck
Fuck
you!
you!
Fuck you! Fuck you! Fuck you!
Then they've not done anything.
Are you injured? You're on nails.
You're a fucking fascist.
You're on nails.
You're a fucking fascist.
Go inside. Go inside. Hold that line. What the fuck is wrong with you? Kidnapping, bitch! You're a kidnapper!
Hey! Fuck you! You're a fucking fascist. You fucking You're a goddamn terrorist, you bitch! Shame on you! Shame on you, you fucking fascist! You fucking race traitor piece of shit! Is that how you fucking treat women? Oh, look at you're real tough with the fucking cannon. You're fucking red. Shame! 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 You stupid word! She's not even resisting! She's not being aggressive! She's not resisting! Record this shit! Record! You're fucking racist! You're not fucking coward! Fuck you! Bitch! Put your fucking can of mace down! Put your fucking can of mace down! The fuck? Fuck you! You're fucking fascist! You're fucking fascist! You're a fucking terrorist! Your country hates you, you piece of fucking shit! You're a fucking piece of shit! You die alone, cold and scared, you fucking bitch!
Take your goddamn scream!
I'm fucking scared of you, bitch!
Your fucking job! Take your fucking job! Fuck you!
Your country hates you! You're right here, bitch! What?
Fuck you!
Get behind the car.
Go fuck yourself now! Hey! Oh shit!
Fuck you! Fuck you! Fuck you! Fuck you! Ha ha ha! Bitch ass! Fuck you!
You're a pathetic piece of shit! Fuck you!
Get the fuck out of my city!
Bastard! Fuck you! You're a pathetic coward! You're a fucking coward! Fuck you! Coward! Fucking coward! Fuck you!
You will pay for your crimes!
I know my rights! I did nothing wrong! I know my rights!
They fucking maced themselves. They're so stupid.
1942, you fucking Nazis! You fucking Nazis! Stop! Is this
We love you, Brady! We love you, Brady! Get a look at your officer. Run!
Nazis come! Is this 1942? Who are you?
This is scary. Fuck them!
Your face will be plastered everywhere, you piece of shit. Everywhere your face will be.
Fucking Nazi piece of shit! Fucking fuck you! Fucking country hates you! Fuck you!
And what about you, a woman? Why are you doing this? What sort of power trip
Fuck
are you
you!
on? What
Fuck
sort of
you!
power trip?
Fuck you! Fuck you!
Fucking shit! Fuck you! I will laugh on your fucking grave! You fucking piece of shit! You stand up after no reason! Fuck you guys! Yeah, breathe in here, fuck you! Yeah! He's hurt!
Everybody that's watching this on Facebook right now, fucking share this stream right now. Right fucking now.
How they're treating them. Look at our comrades. Look at our comrades.
Disgusting pieces of shit! Fashion!
Fuck you guys!
You.
Coward!
You fucking Nazi! You say thank you to being a Nazi? Oh my god, he just said thank you to being a Nazi! Oh my god!
Meanwhile, back home, people are waking up to the routine violence of left-wing activists at protests. You've seen it a lot in the past couple of weeks. In the name of stopping fascism, agitators are showing up at rallies and quickly getting violent. This past weekend, even the Washington Post was forced, against its will, no question, to admit that violence in Berkeley, California was the work of masked left-wingers. Journalist Tim Pool recently attended one of these rallies and quickly became the target of threats. Watch.
Out! Go! Out!
Bye.
Me? Out!
Bye.
Out! Why? Get out of here. Seriously. Get the out of here. They look like their politics. Not phone. Huh?
Do you believe what they say, though? You really believe them?
So, like, I mean,
That's
do what?
naive.
Well, by the same token,
That's naive.
Why would I? Wow. I'm not a tough guy. I'm a journalist.
I'm not making a joke out of it, though. This is my life.
Get the going out of here. Get anything that has ever happened or ever existed.
Tim Pool, the man being barked at in that video, joins us, as does former Berkeley radical Donna Carol Voss. Thanks to you both for joining us. First to you, Tim. I watched that whole video yesterday. It's really, really menacing. But it raises the question I've had since the beginning, which is, who are these people? The masked people, the Black Bloc, Antifa, however you're pronouncing it. Where do they come from? Is this a full-time gig? And what do they believe?
It tends to be a mix of people. Predominantly, I found that they're communists. There's a lot of socialists involved and some anarchists. But typically, I think when you see the violence, the people who are willing to be more violent tend to be communists. That's more of a, I guess, structured ideology, whereas the anarchists are kind of a little loose and don't believe in the authority. But that video is not even the worst. You know, that's just one of the most recent. This guy didn't even touch me. But I've been physically attacked by people associated with the far left and Antifa in the past. And this is, like I said, just one of the more recent instances where they've confronted me for seemingly no reason. I mean, this guy doesn't know me. He doesn't know what I'm doing. I was just walking by in Boston with a camera, and immediately I got bombarded by a group of people with masks on just yelling at me.
Right. If you're looking for the face of hate, it's that right there. But by the way, there have been a bunch of mugshots of these guys after getting arrested, and without the face coverings, they're mostly young, middle-class white kids. Not a very diverse group, interestingly enough. So, Donna, you were a campus radical some time ago in Berkeley, a part of an earlier generation. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the generation you belong to had strong political views, ones I disagree with, but at its core, there was a belief in free speech, wasn't there?
Absolutely. That's Berkeley. That's free speech.
Well, that's gone. And not only is it gone, I don't hear anybody mourning its passing. I don't hear, I mean, presumably a lot of mainstream liberals still believe in free speech. It was one of the pillars of their movement, of what they believe, but I don't hear them standing up to demand the right of others they disagree with to have their say. Why?
No, I should have said that was Berkeley. It's ironic that it was Berkeley for free speech, and now it's where, ground central is for eliminating, crushing free speech. Every protest now is being crushed. Doesn't matter who it is or what it is.
Well, it's really, really noticeable. Tim, what do they want? What does this group want?
Unfortunately, I mean, it's not one group of people. It's just, it tends to be a fractured group of people who share enough of their ideologies that they're willing to get violent to do it. Often I find that many of them truly believe they're fighting a revolution against, the empire of the United States. And I will say that some of these people have legitimate grievances, but as soon as they decide to get violent to push those ideas, they discredit themselves. But, unfortunately, I don't think there's a unified cause behind them. Many of the people that we're seeing today associated with Antifa were just anti-capitalist protesters 4 years ago. Say at Occupy Wall Street, they would chant anticapitalista. Today, they chant antifascista. So it's hard to pin down exactly what, as a single group or as a single ideology, what they're trying to do is, because it tends to change with the trend.
Well, that's kind of the point I'm making. We were forever trying to book some of these people because I'm sincerely interested in what they're after. But Donna, I mean, if you look back at the protest movements of 50 years ago, almost all of them had a specific goal, either, a civil rights bill, end the Vietnam War, end to segregated accommodations. I don't think I understand what the goal of this group is other than burning everything down. Do you?
That's the goal. They have no driving philosophy. They are just all about anarchy. And if there's even a couple of anarchists in there, it makes the whole group anarchist. That's all they want, I think, is anarchy. That's why they fight against free speech in Boston or against anti-racism in Berkeley. It doesn't matter what. If people are out there expressing themselves, Antifa's there to shut them down.
Yeah. Well, it's obviously a fight against civilization itself, and we should all join in fighting back, I think, because that's threatening. Tim, Donna, thank you.
Thank you.
Let's talk about a domestic issue here, and that is one, the continuing debate over illegal immigration, children brought here as children. What happens to them next? House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi got an earful on this when she was trying to speak to this issue in San Francisco. Here's a bit.
You have the audacity! You have the audacity! You have been fighting deportation!
Yes, 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 yes I am. Yes I am. Yes I am. You do not. You don't know what you're talking about.
Carl, that went on and on and on. She eventually said, you guys aren't willing to engage, there's nothing to talk about, and left.
Yeah, look, this is a bunch of loudmouth radicals who, rather than showing up and celebrating Nancy Pelosi's great victory, she and Chuck Schumer, in the course of a meeting with the president in the Oval Office, got him to agree that that they would do a deal on DACA to save the Dreamers from being deported. They should have been there applauding Nancy Pelosi, and instead they were there in her face, being rude and abusive. It was humiliating for her to take that as a sign of the extremists that you find on the street corners in San Francisco and how nutty the left has gotten. They should have been there applauding her progress, and instead they were excoriating her. I thought it's a sign of what is to come as Democrats attempt to deal with this issue, because there's one element in the immigrant community, the illegal immigrant community, that says we got to have everything our way, immediate rights, immediate citizenship, open borders, things that the Democrats themselves are not going to go for. That Nancy Pelosi was being held to account for. They should have been applauding her. She got what most Dreamers want, which is an agreement that there would be a deal to keep them from being deported.
I mean, she really is one of their very toughest advocates and best advocates on Capitol Hill. So what more do you think is the problem? Do you think that they're upset that she was working with President Trump and they have no trust for him? Or is it about that more radical agenda, as you said, they want all the rights and they want them now?
I think it's both. I think there's some element of the Democratic hard left that is so angry at Donald Trump they can't imagine that their leaders would even be in the same room with him. But look, there is an element, and look, I'm an immigration advocate. I believe there ought to be an arrangement by which these people, the dreamers, who are brought here on average at the age of 6.5, the only country they know is the United States of America. We got to resolve that. But these are extremists who have a very left-wing agenda, so left-wing that to them Nancy Pelosi is the enemy, not their friend. It was a remarkable moment. And not only that, but there were 2 other members of Congress with her. Barbara Lee is the leader of the Progressive Caucus. This is the left wing of the House Democrats, and they were screaming at her as well. It was a really remarkable moment that shows how unhinged part of the Democratic Party is, and it's not going away. Both parties have their problems. Republicans and Democrats, we pay a lot of attention to the stresses and strains inside the Republican Party. We saw very clear evidence of the stresses and strains inside the Democratic Party yesterday as well.
I got to say, she looked pretty uncomfortable. I mean, we can't get inside of her mindset, but that was not a comfortable situation. Do you think that she or Congresswoman Lee, do you think they were surprised at all by what met them, or do you think they realized this is part of the conversation?
No, I think they were absolutely surprised. I mean, if you thought people like this might show up, you'd structure the event differently so that you wouldn't have them in your face. These people were standing, feet away from her, around her, behind her. They were screaming at her. They were yelling. She couldn't say anything. Couldn't complete a sentence without people screaming and yelling at her. They obviously were caught unawares by it. Otherwise, they would have had a much better organized event. And as I say, a really amazing moment because Nancy Pelosi has been, she is the most liberal leader of the Democratic Party in either the House or the Senate in history for the Democrats, and that's how she got treated by the left wing of her party.
So here now with more Tucker Carlson, host of Tucker Carlson Tonight. Grew up in California.
Yes, I did.
A lot going on in California.
It's the leading indicator.
They told him he was too brown to...
Well, it's a race-obsessed party. I'm not surprised at all. I mean, ironically. No, that does not surprise me. The whole bet with the Democratic Party in California is that changing demographics win it for them. And they're right to some extent. Immigration has turned it from one of the most reliably Republican states to the most reliably Democratic state. The question now is about the economy. Can you have a state that is basically Latin American in its economic structure? A huge pool of poor people, a small group of rich people, no middle class. That's what California is trying. Its leaders are basically self-consciously pushing policies that result in that. Half of all Californians asked this week said they'd prefer to leave the state. A lot of them already have. What happens then when there's no sort of normal middle class, people making $95,000 left with kids? Like, that's actually where California is going. I don't know what happens.
It's striking to me. Jerry Brown has been around as long as you and I can remember.
He was the governor when I was a kid, and I'm
almost 50. I pulled up a picture of him with Linda Ronstadt, because when I was little, I thought, wow, that Jerry Brown's a really cool guy. He goes out with Linda Ronstadt. And I thought, Tucker will appreciate this. Tucker will appreciate seeing Jerry Brown and Linda Ronstadt. But, all the young people on our staffs, they look at pictures of Jerry Brown today, and they go, wow, who's the old guy who's the governor of California?
Well, he is old.
But he has made an indelible mark on the state over all these years. That
sure.
And now, it's the first time in 20 years that there's an open governor's race in California.
And his father before him, Pat Brown.
That's
Edmund
right.
Pat Brown. Yeah. The funny thing is, this is how much the state has changed, is that Jerry Brown, whom when I was a kid was derided as Governor Moonbeam, supposedly planted opium poppies along the I-5.
President Trump just called him that recently, because he likes that kind of throwback.
Like me, he's an older gentleman. He remembers that. He is now considered by my friends and relatives in California a moderating force. Compared to what is always the question. And so if you live in a state where Jerry Brown is considered sort of sensible and restrained, it tells you a lot. Looks like Gavin Newsom, the former mayor of San Francisco, is going to get it. Also pretty interesting, the same, not just liberal, but the same species of sort of pro-tech liberal will be running the state. I don't see anybody, and I talk to people in California a lot, in state politics at a prominent level who's concerned about the death of the state's middle class. They act like it's just not a big deal. But, the Venezuelan economic model doesn't work. In the end, it collapses.
Yeah.
You need a middle class to sustain an economy, and they're losing theirs.
couple of things I want to ask you about. You're doing a series that I read about last night I thought was very interesting, that basically, you know, sort of a diversity program in air traffic control in this country is potentially making us less safe every time we get on an airplane.
What's terrifying. I'm interested in standards and their decline for a bunch of different reasons. Diversity is one of them, or the sort of ideology of diversity. But under the Obama administration, the FAA changed the standards for becoming an air traffic controller and instituted a screen, a biographical test that awarded points based on how little you knew. So, for example, if you were unemployed for the last 3 years, you got more points than if you had a job. If you knew nothing about science, you got more points than if you were a licensed pilot. This is, again, for an air traffic control job. They intentionally sought the least qualified.
No, they didn't.
Yes, they did. And we've proved it. We have the documents. Our reporter, Alex Pfeiffer, got them. And they don't deny it. I called over to FAA myself to say, can you explain this? How did this make us safer? Air traffic control is a big deal. It's a linchpin of our economy, for one thing. They couldn't answer that because they don't care. That's the point. They don't care whether it makes it safer.
I mean, it's really hard to imagine. I mean, there are a few other areas, but an area, when you look at those maps that show you how many planes are flying across the country at any given moment, it's really hard to imagine a more important job in some ways for safety in this country than the people who are watching the air traffic control.
To award points to someone for failing in science and being unemployed for 3 years is insane. No one can defend it. And by the way, it's not just happening there. It's happening in a lot of other critical parts of American life. But the maintenance of standards, this is an impressive country because we can trust our air traffic control. We take that for granted. We shouldn't, and so it's worth fighting back against.
I mean, the only thing that should be the most important is who's the best, right? Who's the best person at doing that job?
Who's going to keep us safe in that job? Sociology professor, where you might be like, you know, who cares really? It's just some dumb professor. Air traffic control.
Who's on tonight?
A number of people, including...
When I'm done with my show and I can kick back and relax and go like, hey, Tucker's on.
Hit the mini bar in my office, you're free to. Pamela Anderson is on our show, whom I don't know, but who's a much more interesting person than you might think and knows a lot of different people you wouldn't expect her to know, including Julian Assange, to whom she's very close. So anyway, I'm
fascinating.
Her in just a minute. Yeah, I'm interested to hear what she says.
All right, we'll look forward to it. Thanks, Tucker.
Thank you, Martha.
Great to be here.
Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. Every American is born with inherent rights. That's what our founding documents say, and the purpose of the U.S. government is to protect those rights. That has been our national creed for hundreds of years, and it's worked. But the left no longer believes it. Progressives have decided that the Bill of Rights applies only to people who agree with them. Their views are protected by the First Amendment. Your views are hate speech. The Second Amendment covers their security detail. You can't be trusted to have a gun at home. Now the activist left is telling us that people who disagree with them no longer have freedom of movement or association. They can't go to the movies or go to restaurants. If they dare leave their homes, they will be surrounded by mobs and threatened. It's happening. Last Friday, White House Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders and her family were forced to leave a restaurant in Virginia because the owner didn't like their politics. Sanders and her husband went home, but the rest of their family went to another restaurant. That wasn't good enough. They had committed the sin of being related to someone who works at the White House. So progressives continued to harangue them as they tried to eat. This is happening in a lot of places to a lot of people. Protesters, for example, have massed outside the home of White House aide Stephen Miller. In case their intentions weren't clear enough, they put up mock wanted posters with Miller's face on them. A DHS employee, meanwhile, found a burned, decapitated animal carcass on his front porch. Again, the message is crystal clear. Activists on the left are moving toward violence. They are aware of this, and some applaud it. A piece yesterday in Splinter News, which is owned by Univision, explained that intimidating Trump supporters in public places is, quote, just the minimum baseline here. This is all going to get more extreme, and it should, end quote. How extreme? Well, the article fondly recalls the domestic terror bombings of the 1970s. Thousands a year in America. That's our future, the article says. Unfortunately, we're headed there fast. Over the weekend in Los Angeles, Congresswoman Maxine Waters urged the mob to hunt down and find members of the president's cabinet. Here's part of it.
If you think we're rallying now, you ain't seen nothing yet. Already, you have members of your cabinet that have been booed out of restaurants, who have protesters taking up at their house, who's saying no peace, no sleep. No peace, no sleep. Let's stay the course. Let's make sure we show up wherever we have to show up. And if you see anybody from that cabinet in a restaurant, in a department store, at a gasoline station, you get out and you create a crowd. And you push back on them. And you tell them they're not welcome anymore, anywhere.
Maxine Waters isn't just any member of Congress. The Daily Beast calls her, quote, a folk hero. BuzzFeed describes her as the unchallenged new face of the Democratic Party. And indeed she is. She's also a self-described civil rights leader, which makes it a little weird to see her demanding that certain people be denied public accommodations. Sorry, we don't serve your kind at the lunch counter. That's exactly what she is saying. And she said it again yesterday.
I stand by my speech in saying that the protests have already started. They're probably going to continue.
The message of all this is clear. The left no longer considers its political opponents fellow citizens or even human. How long before they start openly calling for something bad to happen to those opponents? Well, in the case of Maxine Waters, it won't be the first time. In 1992, Waters cheered as racist mobs burned Los Angeles. As she put it at the time, riot is the voice of the unheard. When Reginald Denny was dragged from his truck and nearly murdered for the color of his skin, beaten in the head with a cinder block on camera, Waters championed his attackers. She partied with them after their trial. Maxine Waters has a record of endorsing mob violence. Everyone in Washington knows that. Democrats don't care. To his credit, Chuck Schumer did call Waters' most recent remarks, quote, not American. Good for him. But hardly anyone else said anything. Nancy Pelosi blamed Donald Trump for what Waters said. That was a theme. Stop hitting me, they said as they threw the first punch.
I feel that we are in pre-Nazi Germany. The stages of things that are occurring on a daily basis, the obfuscation, the lies, the totalitarian behavior is shocking and horrendous. Yeah. And we have to be vigilant.
They follow the exact pattern that Hitler had. He is evil. He is evil. And the thing is, I thought, oh, he'll come in and he won't really know because he's not that smart. He doesn't, he'll just do a showmanship thing. But he's evil.
This is about racism. This is pure and simple racism. That's all this is. The people who support him are frightened to death of this country becoming the Browning of America.
Something interesting has happened. As progressives become more authoritarian and less tolerant, they seem more convinced that they're fighting actual Nazis rather than their fellow Americans with whom, in the scheme of things, they have only relatively mild political differences. The more they accuse the administration of extremism, the more extreme they become. And that's not surprising, because once you decide that the people who disagree with you are Nazis, everything is allowed. Why wouldn't you threaten them in restaurants or burn their houses down, or who knows? This could very well end in tragedy. You start talking like this and you don't know where it's going to go. Some progressives seem to welcome all that. Quentin James, who's the head of a political action committee that supports Democrats, recently announced that those calling for calm are, quote, accomplices of the current administration. Accomplices? This is the language of total war. It's scary. It has no place in politics. We're heading towards something awful. And the only people who can stop it are the adults on the left. And there are still some. Democratic members of Congress, entertainment figures, religious leaders, media chieftains like Jeff Zucker at CNN or Andy Lack at NBC. They're silent now, cowering and complicit in all of this, but the country badly needs them to cool the rhetoric and rein in the mob. No more Nazi talk on their TV channels. No more screaming at people in restaurants. There's a point of no return, and we are approaching it, and we need their help to pull back.